The ground trembled beneath his feet, ash swirling like a storm as Torin Calder stumbled into the heart of the Crucible. The crowd roared, their thirst for blood louder than the crackling static in the air. His body was broken, his soul bruised, but one thing remained. He was still alive. And in this place, survival was victory. At the far end of the arena, the massive silhouette of Drayce Vorn watched with cold, predatory eyes. "Prove your worth, Shadow," Vorn's voice boomed, cutting through the chaos. "Fail, and you'll burn like the rest." Torin's gaze flicked to Lysara, standing in the shadows, her violet eyes glowing with unspoken intent. She wasn't here for the spectacle. She was here for vengeance, for justice, for everything Vorn had stolen. And Torin was her weapon. If he survived the trial. If you enjoy this story, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters. The sky above the planet Vyrath was a molten tapestry, streaked with veins of amber and violet where the twin suns, Ignis and Vyrath, clashed in an eternal dance of decay. Ignis, the larger of the two, flared unpredictably, its eruptions bathing the surface in waves of searing light that turned stone to glass and forced the denizens of Ash Spire, a jagged settlement perched on the edge of a volcanic plateau, into a relentless cycle of toil and retreat. The air was thick with the tang of sulfur and the faint hum of static, a reminder of the electromagnetic storms that swept the Emberfall expanse, Vyrath's vast, ash-choked wilderness. To live here was to wrestle with a world that seemed determined to erase you. To thrive was a defiance few could claim. Ash Spire rose from the plateau like a fortress of desperation, its walls forged from obsidian slabs and reinforced with the twisted husks of crashed starships. Narrow streets wound through the settlement, lined with stalls where traders bartered under canopies of woven ash vine, a resilient plant that thrived in the heat. The market buzzed with the clatter of volcanic glass coins, the hiss of steam vents, and the cries of merchants offering everything from plasma-forged daggers to jars of condensed vapor, a poor substitute for water in a land where rivers had long since boiled away. Here, survival was a transaction, and every soul had a price, whether paid in goods, blood, or servitude. At the market center stood a dais of blackened stone, its surface pitted and scarred from years of use. On it, a man teetered, his body a testament to endurance and ruin. Torin Calder had once been a wayfinder, a navigator aboard the stellar drift, a survey vessel tasked with mapping the uncharted fringes of the galaxy. His hands, now trembling from exhaustion, had once traced hyperspace routes across holographic charts, his mind alive with dreams of discovering worlds beyond the reach of the Concordance, the interstellar coalition he'd served. 6 months ago, he'd been on the cusp of earning his captain's sigil, a badge that would have granted him a ship of his own. Then the drift struck an uncharted gravitic anomaly, spiraling into Vyrath's atmosphere and shattering against the plateau's edge. The crash claimed most of the crew. Those who survived the impact, Torin among them, were picked off by the elements or the raiders who prowled the expanse. His skin, once a pale gray from years in artificial light, was now blistered and darkened by Vyrath's suns, his lean frame marked with welts and scars. His amber eyes, once sharp with curiosity, stared blankly at the crowd below, dulled by hunger and the weight of lost purpose. He was the last of the drift, a relic of a life that now seemed like a distant myth. The trader overseeing the sale was a hulking Vordak, a species known for their resilience and greed. His hide was a mottled green, pocked with heat scars, and his forearms flexed as he gripped Torin's shoulder with one clawed hand. "This one's scrap," he roared, his voice a guttural rumble that echoed over the market. "Take him for nothing. He's a drain on my stock. Too weak to lift, too stubborn to die." A spray of acidic spittle landed beside Torin's cracked boots, sizzling faintly on the stone. The crowd muttered, their interest waning. No one wanted a slave who looked like he'd collapse under his own weight. Torin barely registered their disdain. He'd stopped caring whether he lived or died weeks ago. Then the throng shifted, and she emerged. She strode forward with the grace of a predator, her presence a sudden stillness in the market's chaos. Her skin was a luminous silver, streaked with faint, iridescent lines that pulsed faintly, perhaps a bioluminescent trait of her species, the Zanari, or a mark of her lineage. Her hair was a cascade of white, shimmering like molten metal, and it flowed behind her in the dry wind, catching the light of Ignis in a halo of defiance. Her eyes, a piercing violet, locked onto Torin with an intensity that jolted him upright, as if she'd reached into his core and demanded he stand. This was Lysara, last of the Zanari clans, a people who had once ruled the expanse with wisdom and strength before the warlord Drayce Vorn unleashed his Iron Legion upon them. Lysara's mother, matriarch Vyrath, had been a beacon of resistance, her strategies keeping the Zanari free for decades. But Vorn's forces, armed with off-world tech and ruthless ambition, had raised their crystal citadels, leaving Lysara as the sole survivor of a massacre that turned her kin to ash. She'd fled into Ash Spire, her title stripped, her purpose reduced to a single, burning goal, to dismantle Vorn's tyranny and resurrect her people from the embers of their past. Now, she stood before the dais, a figure of quiet power in a world that had tried to break her. "I won't take him for nothing," she declared, her voice a clear, resonant note that cut through the noise. She reached into a satchel at her hip and flung a handful of jagged glass coins onto the dais. They clinked against the stone, their edges glinting in the amber light. A paltry sum, yet a deliberate one. "I'll pay a shard's worth." The Vordak's eyes narrowed, his claws twitching as he scooped up the coins and weighed them in a meaty palm. "A shard? That's less than his boots are worth," he snarled, though a flicker of intrigue softened his tone. Lysara met his gaze unflinchingly. "It's more than the nothing you offered," she replied, her voice steady as stone. Her violet eyes slid to Torin, appraising him, not with sympathy, but with the cold precision of a strategist evaluating a gambit. "He'll serve in the Crucible." The trader's laughter boomed, a sound like thunder rolling across the plateau. "That husk. He'll be ash before the first horn sounds." Torin felt a spark flare within him. Not fear, for he'd exhausted that, but a faint ember of defiance. He'd survived the crash, the raiders, the starvation. Who was this bloated creature to judge his limits? Lysara's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile playing across her silver features. "We'll see," she said, and in her words, Torin heard not pity, but a calculated promise. She had a plan, one that stretched beyond this moment, and he was a piece of it, whether he understood it yet or not. The Vordak shrugged, pocketing the coins with a grunt, and handed over a collar of woven ash vine, its surface etched with a Zanari glyph, a spiral within a flame, Lysara's mark. She fastened it loosely around Torin's neck, the tether between them a symbol more than a shackle, and took the lead in hand. As she guided him from the dais, the crowd's murmurs faded into the hiss of the wind and the crunch of ash beneath her boots. "Why me?" Torin croaked, his voice a dry rasp, the first words he'd spoken in days. His throat burned, but curiosity drove him to ask. Lysara didn't glance back, her stride unwavering as she navigated the market's labyrinth. "Because you cost little, and I have less," she said, her tone clipped dismissive. Yet there was a weight to her answer, a shadow of intent that lingered like the heat in the air. It wasn't the full truth, and they both sensed it. Beyond the market, Ash Spire loomed, a jagged silhouette against the violet horizon. Ignis flared overhead, casting the scene in a molten glow, and in its light, two strangers, one a lost navigator, the other a vengeful remnant, stepped into a fate neither could yet grasp. The wind howled across the Emberfall expanse, carrying ash and static as Lysara led Torin through Ash Spire's twisting streets. The ash vine collar around his neck swayed with each step, a symbolic tether brushing his scorched skin. His legs trembled, his body a hollow shell after months of captivity, but he forced himself to match her relentless pace. Her silence was a wall he couldn't breach, her focus fixed ahead as they moved deeper into the settlement. They reached the outskirts where Ash Spire gave way to a jagged slope dotted with crumbling structures. Lysara stopped at a hovel carved into the plateau, fused volcanic glass and starship panels worn smooth by wind and time. She pushed open a creaking door and gestured him inside. "In," she commanded, her voice firm, leaving no room for hesitation. The interior was stark, a packed ash floor swept smooth, walls scarred by plasma burns, a metal stool in the center, a blackened trunk against one wall, and two ash vine mats tucked into opposite corners. A frayed curtain hid a nook, and a faint hum rose from a cracked vent overhead, channeling the plateau's heat. Torin swayed in the doorway, exhaustion blurring his vision, as Lysara crossed to the nook and returned with a flask of condensed vapor and a strip of smoked rock lizard flesh. "Eat," she said, tossing them to him. Slowly, "You're too weak for more." He caught them clumsily, the flask cool against his blistered palms, the meat tough and salty as he tore into it. The vapor slid down his throat, sharp and metallic, but it eased the dryness that had plagued him for days. He forced himself to pace his bites, resisting the urge to devour it all at once. Lysara settled onto the stool, her gaze intense as it fixed on him. "You weren't always a slave," she observed, her tone matter-of-fact. Torin swallowed, wincing as the meat scraped his raw throat. "Wayfinder. Stellar drift. We hit a gravitic rift and crashed." She nodded slightly, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. "Good. That means there's something left in you. Something unbroken." She leaned forward, her voice steady. "I didn't buy you to haul ash or mend walls. I need a fighter for the Crucible." Torin nearly dropped the flask, a laugh bubbling up before it turned into a cough. "A fighter? I'm half dead." Her expression didn't shift. "You survived the crash, the expanse, the raiders. You're stubborn. That's enough to start with." She rose and crossed the trunk, pulling out a crude weapon, a length of plasma-sharpened obsidian lashed to an ash vine grip, and tossed it to him. It clattered to the floor as his weakened hands failed to catch it. "Pick it up," she said, stepping closer. "We begin tomorrow. Rest now. It'll hurt more if you're exhausted." She turned away, leaving him to sink onto one of the mats, her words settling into his bones like a weight he couldn't shake. Morning arrived too soon. The heat crept in as Lysara dragged him from his mat, her grip firm on his arm before releasing him. She led him to a clearing behind the hovel, a rough oval of packed ash ringed by jagged stones and charred posts, a pile of volcanic rocks stacked to one side. "Pick up the blade," she instructed, arms crossed as she stood at the edge. Torin bent to retrieve it, his muscles screaming in protest, the weight awkward in his grip. "Hit me," she said, stepping into the clearing with a casual stride. He hesitated, the blade trembling. "I don't want to hurt you." Her laugh was sharp, cutting through the air. "You won't. Try." He lunged, swinging in a clumsy arc. She sidestepped effortlessly, hooking her leg behind his and sending him crashing to the ash. Dust stung his eyes as he hit the ground. "Again," she commanded, her voice unrelenting. She drilled him for hours, her lessons relentless. Balance on the shifting ash, strike with precision rather than force, read an opponent's intent through their stance. Each failure met her swift correction, a sidestep, a shove, a sharp order to try again. Once, as he stumbled from a wild swing, she pushed him back with a palm to his shoulder. "Focus," she snapped, her tone edged with impatience. By midday, the heat pressed down, and Torin, bruised and sweat-soaked, managed to stand for 10 minutes without falling. A small victory. She called a halt, arms still crossed. "You're learning." Slowly, he collapsed to the ash, chest heaving, the blade slipping from his hand. "Why me?" he rasped, the question heavy with exhaustion. Stronger slaves would have lasted longer today. She crouched close, her presence a quiet force. Stronger, yes, but predictable. Drayce Vorn spies know them. Watch them. You're a shadow, Torin. No one sees you coming, not even you. Her words hung between them, a moment of trust cutting through the pain. She adjusted his twisted collar, then stood swiftly. Inside, before you burn. He followed, his mind a tangle of fatigue and purpose. Weeks blurred into a grueling rhythm. Lysara rebuilt him, not into a hulking warrior, for his frame wouldn't allow it, but into something leaner, sharper, a blade honed by necessity. She fed him carefully, rock lizard meat, ash vine roots, stolen sips of vapor, restoring his strength without breaking his will. Each day, she pushed him harder, her lessons etching into his muscle and bone. Their bond grew through sweat and shared resolve, a partnership forged in the clearing's ash. One evening, as the light faded, she adjusted his stance, guiding his arms into position. "Hold it steady," she murmured close to his ear, then stepped back, her expression unreadable. The first Crucible trial loomed, a proving ground on Ashspire's edge where fighters earned their place in the grand contest. She fitted him with armor of patched ash vine and steel, tightening straps across his chest with practiced hands. "You're ready," she said, pressing the obsidian blade into his palm. "Prove it." They left the hovel, the heat of the expanse pressing against them, and Torin felt the weight of her faith driving him forward, a force stronger than the ash beneath his feet. Weeks of Lysara's unforgiving training had reshaped Torin Calder, his once frail body now lean and wiry, forged through ash and agony. The obsidian blade she'd given him rested in his hand with a growing familiarity, its edge a quiet promise as he trailed her toward the Crucible's edge, a savage proving ground where Ashspire's fighters clawed their way to the grand contest, a ritual of blood that offered freedom to the survivor and dominion to their master. Lysara moved ahead, her silver skin catching the sunlight in fleeting gleams, the iridescent lines along her limbs pulsing like veins of liquid starlight. Her ash-vine tunic clung to her, a second skin that traced the strength beneath, while Torin wore the patched armor she'd crafted, steel and woven strands that flexed with his every step. Her white hair flowed like a river of molten metal, and though her focus was fixed forward, Torin felt her presence tugging at him, a blend of respect, reliance, and a restless heat he couldn't name. The Crucible's edge rose into view, a pit carved into the volcanic plateau, its obsidian walls jagged and sheer, stretching 10 feet toward the sky. Spectators lined the rim, their faces shrouded in ash-vine hoods, their murmurs a hungry drone. The pit's floor was a churned expanse of ash and sand, darkened by old stains, and a low rumble pulse from the geothermal vents below, filling the air with sulfur and the faint reek of death. Torin's gut twisted as he peered down, the weight of what awaited him pressing against his chest. Lysara halted beside him, her violet eyes sweeping the crowd. "This isn't the Grand Crucible," she said softly, her voice a thread beneath the noise. "It's a trial to earn your place. Drayce Vorn's men are here." She tilted her head toward a group in the stands, their armor etched with the Iron Legion's fist and flame sigil. Torin's throat tightened, the name of the warlord who'd shattered Lysara's Zenari, kin echoing in his mind like a curse. She turned to him, her hands moving to adjust his armor. As she tugged a strap near his shoulder, her fingertips brushed the base of his neck, where the ash-vine collar met his skin. The touch was cool, like a drop of water on parched earth, and it sent a strange, slow burn curling down his spine. Not a jolt, but a quiet smolder that made his breath hitch. Lysara's gaze flicked to his, piercing and unreadable, before she stepped back, sliding the obsidian blade into his hand. "Your opponent's big, Slow. Hit the legs," she said, her tone steady, though a faint tremor lingered beneath it. A horn wailed, its sound reverberating off the pit's walls, and the crowd's roar swallowed them. Lysara retreated, and a guard pushed Torin forward. He stumbled down the steps, landing in the ash with a muffled thud. Across the pit stood Korgel, a hulking Vordak with a scarred green hide and 4 sinewy arms, clutching a club of twisted starship metal. At 7 feet, he loomed like a nightmare, his yellow eyes glinting as he growled, fresh meat, and bared jagged teeth. The horn blared again, and Korgel charged, the ground trembling beneath his weight. Torin dodged, the club slicing the air where he'd stood, and slashed at Corbel's leg. The blade cut shallowly, drawing a trickle of blood, but the Vordak roared and pressed on. They circled, Torin's heart pounding as Lysara's voice pierced the din. "Legs, Torin!" He ducked another swing, rolling through the ash, and struck again, this time sinking the obsidian into Corbel's knee. The brute faltered, bellowing, and Torin seized the moment. As Corbel overreached with a final, desperate blow, Torin darted forward, driving the blade upward into his throat. Blood sprayed, and the Vordak collapsed, a fallen giant in the ash. The crowd erupted, but Torin stood frozen, the blade dripping, his mind reeling. He'd killed deliberately, coldly, and the wayfinder he'd been felt like a ghost slipping away. Guards pulled him from the pit, and Lysara met him at the rim, her fists tight with triumph. But the gash in his side, torn by Corbel's club, pulsed with pain, blood staining his armor. Back at the hovel, night fell over the expanse, the sun's light replaced by the faint glow of volcanic fissures beyond the walls. Torin lay on his mat, the air thick with the day's echoes. Lysara knelt beside him, an ash vine cloth in hand, dabbing at his wound. The silence between them was heavy, woven with the violence they'd shared and a tension that refused to fade. As she cleaned the gash, her hand slipped lower, brushing the taut skin along his hip where the armor had split. The touch was fleeting, like the brush of a flame's edge, and it sent a sudden, sharp heat pooling in his core, a sensation less like a spark and more like molten stone settling deep within. He tensed, a low sound catching in his throat, and Lysara's violet eyes snapped to his, a storm flickering in their depths. "I'm not a killer," he muttered, his voice rough, hollow. On the drift, this would have been a crime. Her hand stilled, hovering just above his skin, the warmth of her presence a quiet weight. "On Vyrath, it's survival," she replied, her tone firm but softened by something raw. "This is what we have." He shook his head, the wound stinging as he shifted. "I didn't choose this, spilling blood for cheers." Lysara's gaze sharpened, though her touch remained gentle. "It's not for cheers. It's for the Zenari, for justice against Vorn. How much must I lose before it's enough?" The words lingered, unanswered, and she reached for a jar of ashvine salve. As she applied it, her fingers traced the wound's edge, dipping briefly to the sensitive curve just below his navel. The cool sap contrasted with the heat of her touch, and it felt like a thread tightening inside him, a pull that made his muscles clench and his breath falter. He caught her wrist, his grip instinctive, and her silver skin flushed faintly where their hands met, her pulse quick beneath his fingers. "Why risk this?" he asked, his voice a rasp. "For me." Lysara didn't pull away, her eyes locking with his. "You're my chance," she said, her voice low, trembling slightly, "to take back what's mine." She paused, then added, quieter, and maybe more. The air shifted, thick with unspoken stakes, and Torin released her, his hand falling as she rose swiftly. "Rest," she said, turning away, her white hair a veil hiding her face. The next trial's close. Days bled into preparation. Lysara slipped into Ashspire's shadows, returning with whispers of the next Crucible foes. One evening, she brought a pouch of crystal dust, harvested from Vyrath's depths, a stimulant to hone the senses. "Sprinkle this before the fight," she said, pressing it into his palm. Her fingers lingered, curling briefly around his, and the contact was like ice against a forge, sharp, bracing, and strangely alive, stirring a restless ache in his chest. "Too much, and it'll break you," she warned, her voice steady, but her touch a quiet betrayal of calm. The second trial descended like a storm over the Crucible's edge, Ignis blazing at its zenith while Vyrath streaked the pit with violet shadows. Torin stood at the rim, the ashvine armor creaking as he shifted, the obsidian blade a dark mirror in his grip. He tipped the pouch, letting the crystal dust dissolve on his tongue. A bitter jolt that snapped the world into crystalline focus, the hum of the crowd sharpening into individual voices, the sulfur tang of the air biting deeper. This time, Lysara didn't offer words. She stood silent at the edge, her violet eyes a steady anchor, her faith unspoken but palpable. She'd trained him for this. Now, it was his to claim. The horn wailed, a mournful cry that rippled through the pit, and his opponent slithered from the shadows. A Scarvian named Zethra, her gray skin mottled like storm clouds, her frame lean and coiled with menace. Twin plasma daggers glowed in her hands, their blue edges humming with lethal intent, and her 6 eyes gleamed in a crescent across her brow, tracking him with unerring precision. She didn't taunt like Korgel. Her silence was a blade of its own, cutting through the air as she glided forward, her movements a ripple of deadly grace. The horn sang again, and Zethra struck. No charge, no roar, just a sudden, fluid lunge that closed the distance in a heartbeat. Torin twisted, the first dagger grazing his arm, its heat licking his skin like a serpent's tongue. The second followed, a low arc aimed at his knee, and he leaped, ash bursting beneath him as he landed in a crouch. The pit transformed into a theater of shadows and light, Zethra's daggers painting arcs of blue fire against the violet dusk. She spun, a whirlwind of precision, and Torin countered, his blade slashing upward to meet hers. The obsidian clashed with plasma, a screech of defiance that sent a tremor through his bones. The crystal dust pulsed in his blood, stretching each second into a fragile eternity. He saw the flicker in Zethra's eyes, the barest shift as she pivoted, and ducked as her daggers scissored toward his throat. The air burned where they passed, and he rolled, coming up with ash clinging to his sweat-slicked skin. She pressed her advantage, relentless, her blades a relentless symphony, high-low side, each strike a note in a song of death. Torin parried where he could, his blade a dark conductor, but her speed was a tide he struggled to stem. One dagger caught his shoulder, plasma searing through armor to kiss his flesh, and he hissed, blood welling hot and bright. The crowd's roar faded to a distant hum, drowned by the rhythm of his breath and the scrape of boots on ash. Zethra circled, a predator savoring the hunt, and Torin mirrored her, his mind racing. She wasn't Korgel. Brute force wouldn't win this. He needed cunning, the kind Lysara had drilled into him over weeks of bruising lessons. He feinted right, drawing her in, and as she lunged, he dropped low, kicking a cloud of ash into her face. Zethra faltered, her 6 eyes blinking against the grit, and Torin seized the moment, slashing at her exposed flank. The obsidian bit deep, dark blood spilling like ink, and she staggered, a hiss escaping her lipless mouth. She recovered fast, her daggers flashing in a desperate counterattack, but the ash had shifted the balance. Torin danced back, letting her overextend, then struck again, this time at her wrist, severing tendons with a wet snap. One dagger fell, its glow dimming in the sand, and Zethra's scream split the air, raw and furious. He didn't hesitate. With a final, fluid thrust, he drove the blade into her chest, piercing the thin armor where her ribs parted. The Scarvian froze, her remaining dagger slipping from her grasp, and collapsed, a gray heap swallowed by the ash. The crowd erupted, a tempest of cheers and gasps, but Torin stood still, the blade dripping, his chest heaving. The kill was cleaner than Korgel's, yet heavier, proof of his evolution, a shadow honed by Lysara's hand. Guards dragged him from the pit, and the whispers swelled. Torin, the shadow, a name etched in blood and ash. Vorn's spies watched, their cold stares a weight he felt in his bones. That night, Lysara tended a cut on his forearm, her fingers brushing the tender skin inside his elbow. The touch was soft, like a breeze over embers, sending a slow, coiling tension up his arm that settled heavy in his throat. "You're more than I hoped," she murmured, her violet eyes catching his. He swallowed the air thick. "And you're more than a master," he said, the words a bridge he couldn't unbuild. Her lips curved, a rare, fragile smile. and the hovel pulsed with the promise of what they might become. As the volcanic glow dimmed beyond the walls, the weight of the day pressed them closer. Lysara set the salve aside, her hand lingering on his arm, her gaze softening into something unguarded. Torin reached for her, his fingers tracing the edge of her tunic, a silent question in the quiet. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, her breath warm against his jaw, her white hair brushing his chest like a whisper of starlight. The space between them dissolved, a tangle of limbs and shared heat, their shadows merging on the hovel's walls. A fleeting, unspoken union born of survival and need. The night folded around them, the ash and blood of the Crucible fading into a stillness where only they remained, two souls forged anew in the ember-lit dark. Lysara emerged from the hovel, her white hair catching the morning light, her violet eyes sharp as she scanned the horizon. The night before had shifted something between them, a silent pact sealed in the ember-lit dark, but neither spoke of it now. Words felt fragile against the weight of what they'd shared, an unspoken bond that tethered them beyond master and fighter, beyond survival itself. She carried a small satchel slung across her shoulder, its contents clinking faintly, and gestured for him to follow. "We're not training today," she said, her voice steady, purposeful. "There's something you need to see." They wove through Ashspire's outskirts, past the market's clamor and the narrow alleys where shadows traded secrets. The air grew thicker as they descended the plateau's edge, sulfur rising from fissures that split the ground like wounds. Lysara led him to a hidden crevice, its entrance masked by a curtain of ash vine, and slipped inside. Torin followed, ducking under the low overhang, and found himself in a narrow tunnel carved for volcanic rock. The walls shimmered with flecks of crystal, remnants of Vyrath's ancient core, and a faint hum vibrated through the stone, a pulse from the planet's restless heart. The tunnel opened into a cavern, its ceiling lost in shadow, its floor littered with debris, shards of glass, rusted metal, and bones bleached by time. At the center stood a jagged slab of obsidian, etched with swirling glyphs that glowed faintly, their light pulsing in rhythm with the hum. Lysara approached it, her fingers tracing the markings with a reverence Torin hadn't seen before. "This is a Zenari remnant," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "One of the last. My people built these to mark our sanctuaries, places of strength, of memory." Torin stepped closer, the air cool against his skin despite the plateau's heat. "What does it say?" he asked, his eyes on the glyphs. Lysara's hand stilled, her expression tightening. "It's a promise," she replied. "A vow to endure, to reclaim what was lost. Drayce Vorn shattered us, but he couldn't erase this." She turned to him, her gaze piercing. "You're part of that promise now, Torin. The Crucible isn't just survival, it's our path to him." The weight of her words settled over him, heavier than the ash vine collar he'd once worn. He'd fought for her, killed for her, but this was more, a purpose that stretched beyond the pit, beyond Ashspire's brutal games. "How?" he asked, his voice rough with a question. "Vorn's a warlord. Armies, weapons, a fortress. We're two against that." Lysara reached into her satchel and pulled out a small, jagged object, a fragment of crystal, its edges sharp and glinting with an inner fire. "This," she said, holding it up, "a shard from the Zenari citadels. It's more than stone. It's a key, a weapon if we use it right. Vorn's power comes from tech he stole from my people. This can disrupt it, turn his own strength against him." She closed her fist around the shard, her knuckles whitening. "But we need to get close, inside his fortress. The Grand Crucible is our way in." Torin studied her, the resolve in her eyes a mirror to the fire he'd felt growing within himself. "And if we fail?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "We don't. Failure's death, for us, for everything I've fought to keep alive." She stepped back, slipping the shard into her satchel. "You've proven yourself in the trials. The next fight's bigger, more eyes, more stakes. We build your name, draw Vorn's attention. He'll want you in the grand contest himself. The cavern's hum seemed to deepen, a resonance that echoed in Torin's chest. He nodded, the path ahead sharpening into focus. Then we keep going, he said, his voice steady. Through the Crucible, to him, Lysara met his gaze, a flicker of gratitude softening her features, and for a moment, the air between them felt alive, not with tension, but with trust. Days turned to weeks, and the Crucible's trials grew fiercer. Torin faced a gauntlet of foes, a hulking brute with a chain whip, a wiry scavenger armed with venom-tipped claws, each fight a brutal dance that honed him further. Lysara watched from the rim, her presence a constant, her violet eyes tracking his every move. She no longer shouted commands. She didn't need to. He'd learned her lessons, internalized the rhythm of survival she'd carved into him. The crowd's whispers grew louder. Torin, the shadow, and with each victory, Vorn's spies lingered longer, their reports filtering back to the warlord's blackstone fortress atop the plateau. Between fights, they returned to the cavern, piecing together a plan from fragments of Lysara's memory and the shard's faint hum. She spoke of the Zanari citadels, towering spires of crystal and steel, now rubble under Vorn's rule, and the tech they'd housed. Energy conduits, shield matrices, weapons that could turn ash to glass. The shard, she explained, could overload those systems if they reached the fortress's core. It's a gamble, she admitted one night, the cavern's glow casting shadows across her face. But it's all we have. Torin traced a finger along the obsidian slab. Its glyphs a map he couldn't read, but felt in his bones. And after, he asked, his voice quiet, if we bring him down, what then? Lysara looked away, her white hair falling across her shoulder. I don't know, she said, softer than he'd ever heard her. The Zanari are gone. Maybe I rebuild. Maybe I just stop running. She glanced back, her eyes meeting his. What about you? He thought of the stellar drift, of stars he'd once dreamed of charting, now distant memories against Vyrath's harsh sky. I don't know either, he admitted. But I'm here with you. That's enough for now. Her expression softened, a rare vulnerability breaking through her steel, and she nodded, the moment sealing their alliance deeper than words could reach. The final trial before the Grand Crucible arrived, a three-way melee in the pit, a test of chaos and endurance. Torin faced a pair of foes, a Vordak with a plasma axe and a human scavenger wielding a jagged spear, their alliance uneasy but deadly. The crowd roared as the horn sounded, ash billowing as the fight began. Torin moved like a shadow, dodging the axe's searing swings and parrying the spear's thrusts, letting his opponent's mistrust fracture their coordination. He struck when the Vordak overreached, driving his blade into its side, then turned as the scavenger lunged, disarming her with a twist that sent the spear clattering away. A final slash ended it, and he stood alone, blood-streaked and breathless, the pit a graveyard at his feet. Lysara met him at the rim, her fists clenched not in triumph, but in quiet resolve. You're ready, she said, her voice firm. Vorn's called you to the Grand Crucible, his fortress, his rules. We're in. Torin wiped the blood from his blade, the weight of her words sinking in. The path to Vorn was open, but it was a road paved with ash and fire, one they'd walk together. As they left the pit, the twin suns dipped low, casting Ash Spire in a crimson glow. The hovel waited, a fragile sanctuary, but the cavern's hum lingered in Torin's mind. A promise, a vow, a chain unraveling toward a future neither could yet see. The Grand Crucible loomed atop the volcanic plateau, a fortress of black stone and twisted steel that crowned Ash Spire like a tyrant's throne. Its walls rose sheer from the ash-choked expanse, punctuated by spires that glinted with stolen Zanari tech. Conduits of energy pulsing faintly, their hum a low growl across the emberfall expanse. Ignis burned high overhead, its amber light casting the fortress in a molten glow, while Vera lingered near the horizon, a violet scar against the sky. Torin Calder stood at the plateau's edge, the obsidian blade sheathed at his side, the ashvine armor patched and scarred from weeks of trials. Beside him, Lysara adjusted the satchel at her hip, the shard within a silent promise of chaos and hope. They'd earned this moment. Every fight, every scar, every whispered name in the pit had led them here. Drayce Vorn had summoned Torin to the Grand Crucible, a spectacle meant to crush dissent and cement his rule, but Lysara saw it as their opening. "Stay sharp," she said, her voice cutting through the wind's howl. "Vorn's no fool. He'll test you beyond the pit. The shard's our edge, but we need to reach the core." Torin nodded, his jaw tight. The plan was simple in theory. Survive the contest, infiltrate the fortress, and use the shard to cripple Vorn's defenses. Simple but soaked in blood. A horn blared, its mournful wail echoing off the fortress walls, and a gate of rusted metal groaned open. Guards in Iron Legion armor, black plates etched with flame, herded them forward, their plasma rifles humming with menace. The crowd awaited inside, a sea of hooded figures packed into tiered stands that ringed a vast arena, its floor a mosaic of ash and shattered stone. At the far end, a platform loomed, draped in crimson banners, where Vorn himself sat, a hulking figure in spiked armor, his face obscured by a helm forged from Zenari crystal, its facets glinting with captured light. Torin stepped into the arena, the crowd's roar a physical force that pressed against him. Lysara followed, her presence a steady anchor as she took her place among the spectators, her satchel clutched tight. The horn sounded again, and the gates rumbled, releasing Torin's opponents, 3 fighters, each a survivor of their own brutal trials. A Vordak towered first, its 4 arms wielding twin plasma axes, its green hide scarred and pitted. Beside it slithered a Scarvian, leaner than Zethra, but no less deadly, its 6 eyes locked on Torin as it hefted a chain spear tipped with barbs. Last came a human, a wiry woman with a plasma whip coiled at her hip, her face a mask of scars and grim resolve. The fight began with no preamble, a clash of steel and fire that turned the arena into a maelstrom. The Vordak charged, its axes swinging in wide arcs, and Torin ducked, rolling through the ash to avoid the searing blades. The Scarvian struck next, its chain spear lashing out like a serpent, the barbs grazing his armor as he twisted aside. The woman hung back, her whip cracking through the air, a streak of blue flame that forced Torin to keep moving. He couldn't win with strength alone. This was chaos, and he'd learned to thrive in it. He targeted the Scarvian first, its speed the greatest threat. Feinting left, he drew its spear, then lunged as it recoiled, driving his blade into its flank. Dark blood sprayed, and it hissed, staggering back. The Vordak roared, closing in, and Torin dropped low, slashing at its legs as he'd done with Korgel. One axe fell from its grip, clattering to the stone, but the second grazed his shoulder, heat searing through armor. The crowd cheered, a tidal wave of sound, but Torin ignored it, his focus narrowing to the rhythm of survival. The woman saw her chance, her whip snapping toward him, wrapping around his wrist. Pain flared as plasma bit into his skin, and she yanked, pulling him off balance. He twisted, using the momentum to roll forward, and sliced the whip's cord with a desperate slash. Freed, he surged at her, tackling her to the ash before she could draw a secondary blade. A quick thrust ended her, her body slumping beneath him, and he rose, breathless, to face the wounded pair still standing. The Vordak and Scarvian circled, their alliance fraying as bloodlust took hold. Torin let them turn on each other, the Vordak's axe clashing with the Scarvian spear, a brutal exchange that gave him a moment to breathe. When the Scarvian faltered, its chain tangled, Torin struck, burying his blade in its chest. The Vordak bellowed, swinging wildly, and Torin dodged, waiting for an opening. It came as the beast overreached, and he drove his weapon upward, piercing its throat. It collapsed, a mountain of flesh and steel, and the arena fell silent for a heartbeat before erupting in a deafening roar. Torin stood, blood-streaked and battered, the last alive in the pit. Vorn rose from his platform, his voice booming through the helm's amplifiers. "The shadow prevails," he declared, a cold edge to his tone. "Step forward, champion." Guards flanked Torin, escorting him from the arena, and Lysara slipped through the crowd, shadowing them as they entered the fortress's depths. The corridors were a labyrinth of black stone and humming conduits, the air thick with the tang of molten metal. Torin's escort led him toward Vorn's throne room, a cavernous hall lined with trophies, shattered Zenari relics, skulls of fallen foes, and banners stained with ash. Lysara trailed behind, unnoticed by the guards, her movements silent as she tracked their path. The plan hinged on this. Vorn's arrogance would draw him close, and Torin's victory would grant them access to the fortress's core. Vorn awaited on a throne of fused steel, his helm reflecting the hall's dim light. "You've earned your freedom," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But I offer more. Serve me, Shadow, and Ash Spire bends to you." Torin's grip tightened on his blade, still sheathed but ready. "I'm not here to bend," he replied, his voice steady despite the ache in his bones. Vorn laughed, a sound like grinding stone, and rose, descending the steps with a predator's grace. Before he could respond, a commotion erupted. Lysara burst from the shadows, the shard in her hand glinting as she hurled it toward a conduit embedded in the wall. It struck, embedding deep, and the hall shuddered, the hum escalating to a scream as energy surged wildly. Vorn roared, drawing a massive plasma sword, its blade flaring red, and lunged at her. Torin intercepted, his obsidian blade clashing with Vorn's, the impact jarring his arms. Sparks flew, illuminating the hall in bursts of light, and the conduits began to spark, arcs of power crackling through the air. They fought in a storm of steel and fire, Torin's speed against Vorn's brute strength. The warlord's sword carved furrows in the stone, but Torin dodged, striking at gaps in the spiked armor. Lysara darted to another conduit, slamming a scavenged tool into its casing, amplifying the shard's disruption. The fortress trembled, alarms blaring as Vorn's stolen tech turned against him. A conduit exploded, showering the hall in shards of crystal, and Vorn faltered, his helm cracking under the strain. Torin seized the moment, driving his blade into Vorn's side, piercing a seam in the armor. The warlord bellowed, swinging wildly, but Torin ducked, slashing again, this time at the helm, shattering its crystal faceplate. Vorn's face emerged, scarred and furious, human yet twisted by years of tyranny. "You'll burn for this," he snarled, but his strength waned as the fortress's core overloaded, conduits bursting in a cascade of light and heat. Lysara shouted, "Now!" and Torin pulled back, joining her as they ran for the core, a pulsing chamber at the hall's end, its walls lined with Zenari tech. She plunged the shard into its heart, and the room erupted, a wave of energy ripping through the fortress. Vorn staggered, his sword falling, and the ceiling buckled, stone raining down as the core collapsed. Torin grabbed Lysara, pulling her through a crumbling corridor as the fortress shook itself apart, Vorn's screams swallowed by the chaos. They emerged into the expanse, the fortress a smoldering ruin behind them, its spires toppling into the ash. The twin suns hung low, casting long shadows over the wreckage, and Ashspire survivors watched from below, their murmurs rising like a tide. Torin leaned against a boulder, his breath ragged, the obsidian blade still clutched in his hand. Lysara stood beside him, the satchel empty, her expression a mix of exhaustion and something lighter, relief, perhaps, or the ghost of freedom. "It's done," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Vorn's gone." Torin nodded, the weight of the crucible lifting, replaced by a stillness he hadn't known since the drift. "What now?" he asked, echoing their talk in the cavern. She looked out over the expanse, the ash swirling in the wind. "We figure it out," she replied. Together, the plateau trembled faintly, a final echo of the fortress's fall, but the hum was gone. The chains of Vyrath, Vorn's, the crucibles, their own, had unraveled, leaving them standing on the edge of something new.